You know, there's a peculiar paradox in the world of diplomacy, a paradox that's difficult for the average onlooker to grasp because it unfolds not in the explosive moments of loud rhetoric or military spectacle, but in the quieter spaces, where restraint becomes a form of dominance and silence, when wielded with purpose, becomes deafening. Let's consider this. For decades, global diplomacy has largely been choreographed by the West, with the United States at its helm. The power dynamic was clear. Washington spoke, and the rest of the world reacted. But something very subtle, and far more significant than it appears on the surface, has shifted, not through confrontation, not through protest, but through a kind of dignified refusal to play the game on terms dictated by others. And at the center of this shift stands Dr. S. JAISHANKAR, India's External Affairs Minister, not with a raised fist, but with a raised standard of consciousness. What we are witnessing is not just a change in India's foreign policy, it's a change in India's psychological posture. That's what makes this moment revolutionary. You see, the West, particularly the United States, has grown accustomed to commanding moral authority in global discourse. When it criticizes, it expects shame. When it demands alignment, it anticipates obedience. And when it exerts pressure, it assumes collapse. But in recent years, and most pointedly during a series of global crises, be it the Russia-Ukraine war, oil diplomacy, or trade realignment, India has responded with something far more unsettling to Western diplomats than confrontation. India responded with silence, and not the silence of uncertainty or hesitation, but the silence of a man who knows who he is and has nothing left to prove. That's the genius of JAISHANKAR. He understood a deeper truth, one that's often lost in the chaos of modern geopolitics, that psychological power precedes political power. Before a nation can rise globally, it must first stop asking for validation. It must stop seeking permission to assert its own reality, and India, for a long time, had forgotten that. We had internalized the idea that Western approval was the highest form of legitimacy. We believed we needed to explain ourselves, to justify our decisions, to soften our stance so that it might align more closely with Western values or expectations. But what changed, what JAISHANKAR helped change, was this internal landscape. He brought forth a new kind of assertiveness, not loud, not boastful, but firm, conscious, grounded, and most importantly, indifferent to whether or not the West liked it. Now, some critics would say that silence in the face of criticism is weakness. That when America or Europe puts forward a position, silence implies evasion or indecision. But that's only true if you view power as a theatrical performance, and JAISHANKAR doesn't. He plays a deeper game. His silence was never about evasion, it was about elevation, about choosing which conversations are worth having, and which accusations are too absurd to even dignify with a reply. There's a powerful moment that illustrates this. When Western reporters tried to corner him asking, quite condescendingly, why India was still buying oil from Russia, he didn't get defensive, he didn't bark back. He looked them straight in the eye and said, "We will do what is in our national interest, period." No long justification, no appeal to emotion, no attempt to earn moral points, just a clean, clear articulation of sovereignty. And this is precisely what the United States and much of the West were not prepared for. They were used to dealing with two kinds of nations, those who begged and those who barked. But India, under JAISHANKAR's diplomatic leadership, became a third kind, the nation that simply was asterisk. And in a world addicted to spectacle, there is nothing more disruptive than that. We're witnessing the birth of a new form of leadership, one that doesn't crave the spotlight but shapes the entire stage, one that doesn't announce power but embodies it. This is the kind of presence that rattles empires, not because it's violent, but because it's free. And this brings us to a deeper psychological truth. People, like nations, must eventually decide who they are without reference to the dominant force around them. True strength doesn't come from rebellion alone. It comes from self-definition. It comes from knowing deeply and unshakably what you stand for, and standing by it whether the world claps or not. India, through JAISHANKAR, is doing exactly that. It is crafting a new identity. One not carved by colonial history or constrained by diplomatic courtesy, but one forged in clarity, moral, cultural, strategic clarity. The world doesn't quite know how to deal with this version of India yet. And that's the point, that's the strike, not a loud one, not a flashy one, but a final one. A psychological strike that dismantles the power dynamic without ever raising a hand. You see, when you respond with silence, you force the other to confront their own noise. When you refuse to validate a flawed assumption, you don't just win the argument. You make the argument irrelevant. That's what JAISHANKAR has done, and that's what India is learning to do. This isn't just about foreign policy. It's about how we, as individuals and as a nation, choose to carry ourselves in a world that constantly demands we play smaller than we are. Silence, when rooted in conviction, becomes a roar the world can't ignore. And so, here is the closing thought. Asterisk, speak when it is necessary, but be silent when your presence alone is enough to shake the ground. Asterisk, that is not passivity, it is power. And the world is finally learning that when India is quiet, it's not because it lacks something to say. It's because it no longer needs permission to exist. There's something fundamentally transformative that happens when a nation begins to see itself not as it has been told it is, but as it actually is, and even more importantly, as it could be asterisk. That moment of realization is not political in the narrow sense. It's psychological, it's philosophical. It marks the end of imitation and the beginning of authorship for much of the post-colonial world, and India especially. The global order has functioned like an inherited script. One written elsewhere, one in which the roles were already assigned, the West would lead and the rest would follow. This structure wasn't just enforced through military alliances or economic hierarchies. It was internalized through education, media, culture, and diplomacy. It created a class of thinkers and policymakers who spoke in borrowed idioms and made decisions not from the center of their own civilizational compass, but from the periphery of someone else's expectations. What JAISHANKAR has done, what makes his approach both radical and deeply rooted, is that he's rejected the script, not out of rage, not as a rebel without a cause, but as someone who finally realized that the script no longer fits the soul of the nation. That India, if it is to rise as a global power, must stop being a rule taker. It must become a rule maker, and more than that, it must stop mimicking the architecture of Western power and instead offer something of its own. This is a psychological emancipation, a breaking of the invisible leash. You can't understand JAISHANKAR'S diplomacy unless you understand this inner shift. Because everything he does on the world stage, whether it's asserting India's neutrality on global conflicts, or defending its energy choices, or challenging the West's double standards, it all stems from this one underlying premise, that India is no longer negotiating from a place of dependency. It is negotiating from a place of dignity, but that dignity isn't some vague nationalist sentiment, it's philosophical. It comes from re-engaging with India's civilizational wisdom, from recognizing that the foundation of global cooperation doesn't have to be hegemony. That the organizing principles of international order don't have to be based on domination or submission. They can be based on dharma, on balance, on responsibility, on mutual respect. That's not a regression into ancient thinking. It's a leap forward into a deeper paradigm. When the West speaks of rules-based international order, it usually implies an order that it wrote, that it polices, and that it interprets when convenient. But India, under JAISHANKAR'S guidance, has begun to push back, not just tactically, but philosophically. It is asking, Asterisk, who wrote these rules, who benefits from them, and why should moral legitimacy be monopolized by those who violated those very rules for centuries? Asterisk, that's a dangerous question, because once it's asked openly, it reveals the fragility of the current world order. It exposes the hypocrisy embedded in it. The same nations that lectured India on democracy have weaponized surveillance and censorship. The same powers that talk of sovereignty have violated it again and again under the banner of intervention. And the same institutions that claim neutrality are structurally biased toward Western interests. Jaishankar doesn't scream this from podiums. He doesn't need to. He does something far more subversive. He refuses to conform. He refuses to explain why India doesn't align with every Western position. He refuses to apologize for doing what is necessary for India's growth, security, and future. And most powerfully, he refuses to speak in a way that assumes Western categories are the only valid ones. That's the psychological shift, and it's why this moment in Indian diplomacy feels so different. Because for the first time in decades, India is not just speaking to the world, it's speaking asterisk from asterisk itself. This doesn't mean India is antagonistic to the West. That would be a shallow reading. What it means is that India is now engaging on equal footing. Not as a junior partner, not as a hesitant ally, not as a moral student, but as a sovereign civilization, state with its own perspective on how the world should be structured. There is a quiet revolution in that stance, because it gives courage to other nations who have also been playing by someone else's rules. It tells them, asterisk, you don't need to become the West to become powerful. You don't need to abandon your roots to be modern. You don't need to mimic to matter. Asterisk, you can be modern and traditional. You can be scientific and spiritual. You can be global and rooted. And that's the alternative India is beginning to embody on the world stage. One that doesn't just resist Western dominance, but redefines what global leadership could mean. This is more than politics, it's identity at scale. When a nation reclaims its own voice, it doesn't just change how it speaks, it changes what it says and what it refuses to say. It refuses to participate in narratives that diminish it. It refuses to play roles it didn't choose, and it begins, slowly but surely, to write its own story. That's what Jaishankar has set in motion. A shift from reaction to creation, from validation, seeking to vision, casting, and when you view it that way, you begin to see that India's rise is not just geopolitical, it's psychological. It's the emergence of a nation that no longer defines itself by what it lacks, but by what it has to offer. And so the challenge for all of us is to embody that same principle in our own lives, to stop borrowing identities, to stop shrinking ourselves to fit the expectations of others, and to begin, perhaps for the first time, to act not from fear of rejection, but from clarity of purpose. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. Asterisk, the moment you stop asking for permission to be yourself, the world begins to take you seriously. Asterisk, that's not defiance, that's freedom. And that, more than any weapon or alliance, is the foundation of real power. You know, when we speak of power in the modern world, we often reduce it to economics, military might, or technology. These are the metrics that dominate headlines and define rankings. But there's another dimension, a more enduring and less visible one, that rarely enters the conversation, and that's the moral and civilizational architecture a nation brings to the global table. This is where India's rise, guided by the philosophical grounding of leaders like S. Jaishankar, becomes not just a geopolitical shift, but a civilizational correction. What's truly profound is that India's emergence as a global power isn't modeled after the Western idea of empire. It's not about domination. It's not about enforcing a universal ideology or projecting moral superiority under the guise of human rights or democracy. India's rise, rather, is deeply rooted in a much older, richer worldview, one that has sustained the subcontinent through millennia of transformation, invasion, resilience, and regeneration. And that world, you at its core, is multipolar. But let's be careful here. Multipolarity is often interpreted as a strategic stance, a practical response to a world where the U.S. no longer holds unchallenged sway, but it's more than that, far more. For India, multipolarity is not merely tactical, it is dharmic, it is philosophical. It reflects the nature of existence as understood through the lens of Indian civilization, complex, diverse, relational, and balanced. You see, Western thought, particularly since the Enlightenment, has been obsessed with binary thinking, right and wrong, good and evil, east and west, us and them. It simplifies the world into digestible categories and then builds systems of power on those categories. But Indian thought doesn't follow that trajectory. It recognizes multiplicity as the natural order of things. It holds contradiction not as failure, but as feature. Dharma is not dogma. It's a contextual compass that helps navigate complexity without forcing everything into a rigid structure. This is what Jaishankar brings to the global stage. Not just diplomacy, but depth. Not just negotiation, but nuance. When he speaks of a multipolar world, he's not just pushing for more power centers. He's arguing for a reimagining of international order itself, one that mirrors the pluralistic spirit of the Indian worldview. And that's deeply unsettling to those accustomed to unipolar control. Why? Because a dharmic approach doesn't play by the rules of ideological supremacy. It refuses to place one model, liberal democracy, neoliberal capitalism, Western secularism, on a pedestal and demand that all others conform to it. Instead, it asks each nation to act in accordance with its own inner logic, its own cultural truths, and its own responsibilities. It values sovereignty not as a shield against critique, but as a recognition of difference. When India refuses to take sides in a U.S.-China rivalry, it's not being indecisive, it's embodying this deeper philosophy. When it continues its relationships with Russia while expanding ties with the West, it's not fence-sitting, it's balance. It's the recognition that no single pole can claim moral authority over the entire world. That the human story is too vast, too layered, to be governed from a single ideological center. This is a radical departure from how global power has functioned for centuries, and it requires, above all, psychological courage. Because it's far easier to pick a side, it's far easier to accept the hierarchy and play within it, hoping to climb higher by pleasing the powerful. That's what many post-colonial nations have done. But India, led by voices like Jaishankar, is refusing that model. It's not trying to join someone else's empire. It's trying to restore balance to a system that has been lopsided for too long. And let's be clear, this isn't nostalgia. This isn't some romantic invocation of the past. It's a forward-looking proposition rooted in the wisdom of the past. Because what Indian civilization offers the world today is not just yoga or Ayurveda or philosophy in isolation, but a systems-level way of thinking about power, responsibility, and coexistence. A way that recognizes the moral limitations of dominance and the necessity of dialogue. When Jaishankar speaks at international forums, there's often a quiet tension in the room, because he doesn't speak with the nervous energy of someone trying to impress. He speaks with the stillness of someone who knows where he comes from. That stillness, that depth, is drawn not from Western political theory, but from thousands of years of philosophical inquiry into the nature of reality, ethics, governance, and meaning. You might say he's channeling something older than the modern state system, something wiser, and that makes him, and India, not just a strategic actor, but a civilizational one, and the world is beginning to notice. Because in a world saturated with noise, the calm voice that speaks with rooted conviction stands out. In a world obsessed with speed and growth, the nation that insists on balance and harmony becomes an anomaly, and ultimately an inspiration. This is the deeper strike, not a strike of missiles or sanctions, but of meaning. JAISHANKAR'S diplomacy is reintroducing the language of Dharma into a world that has forgotten it. He's reminding us that power without wisdom is tyranny, that alignment without authenticity is slavery, and that leadership without a moral foundation is nothing but, well, rest chaos. So what does that mean for us? It means we need to stop thinking in binaries. We need to learn how to hold complexity without collapsing into confusion. We need to rediscover our roots, not to retreat into the past, but to draw strength from it as we shape the future. And above all, we must remember this, asterisk, a civilization that knows itself need not shout to be heard. Asterisk, the world is finally listening to India not because it demands to be listened to, but because it has something worth hearing. Let that be your calling too, in your life, in your work, in your thinking. Don't seek power by imitating others. Seek clarity by understanding yourself, because clarity, like Dharma, does not waver in the face of noise. It endures, and eventually it leads. There's a curious thing that happens when a dominant power assumes that its influence is not only inevitable, but permanent. It stops listening, it stops adapting. It starts believing that pressure, whether political, economic, or moral, is a substitute for persuasion, and that assumption becomes its undoing, because the moment people stop reacting the way the power expects them to, the illusion begins to crack. That's exactly what happened when the West, particularly the United States, tried to pressure India, and that's exactly what JAISHANKAR refused to bow to. Now, let's not misunderstand the dynamic. The United States wasn't issuing ultimatums in the old imperial sense. No, it was subtler than that. The pressure came wrapped in language about shared values, rules, based order, and responsible global citizenship. But underneath it all was a clear message. Asterisk, you're either with us, or you're with those we've marked as problematic. Asterisk, and India, instead of folding, as so many expected, chose a third path, not resistance for its own sake, but reasoned independence. This isn't just a diplomatic event, it's a psychological shift in global politics, because for decades the U.S. has relied on a model of moral high ground diplomacy. It criticizes with confidence, assuming that its history, its systems, and its institutions grant it automatic credibility. And for decades, many nations, out of insecurity, pragmatism, or fear, played along, but JAISHANKAR understood something profound. Asterisk, moral authority isn't inherited, it's demonstrated. Asterisk, and in this case, the U.S. failed to demonstrate it. Let's look at the specifics. When the war in Ukraine broke out, the West launched a full-spectrum campaign, not just against Russia, but against any nation that didn't echo its condemnation in lockstep. India's refusal to join sanctions was treated by many in the Western press as betrayal, as if morality were measured by alignment, as if a sovereign country had no right to weigh its own interests and historical relationships before choosing a stance. But JAISHANKAR didn't respond with defensiveness. He didn't try to appease or explain away India's decision. He simply pointed out a glaring inconsistency. Asterisk, why should India abandon its national interests when the West never does? Asterisk, he reminded the world, calmly, logically, unapologetically, that Europe has a long history of privileging its own concerns, often at the cost of others, and that expecting India to behave differently now was, frankly, hypocritical. This was more than a rebuttal, it was a reversal of the psychological pressure. The hunter became the hunted, the accuser had to explain itself. That's the genius of JAISHANKAR'S diplomacy, not in how he attacks, but in how he redirects. He doesn't get drawn into the emotional game. He simply changes the terms of engagement. And here's what's even more striking. The U.S. and its allies weren't ready for that. They assumed India, out of fear of isolation or loss of favor, would toe the line. They assumed the pressure would work, but it backfired because it was based on outdated assumptions about India's psychological posture. This isn't the India of the 1990s, desperate for recognition and foreign approval. This is a country that knows its worth and doesn't need to be told who its friends are. The Western pressure campaigns, in effect, revealed their own weakness. They exposed the fragility of the so-called rules-based order, which only seems to apply when it benefits those who wrote the rules. And in pushing too hard, they lost the one thing that makes diplomacy effective, credibility. Jaishankar, on the other hand, gained something far more valuable, respect, not just from the West, but from the rest of the world. Nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America watched closely, and what they saw was not defiance for its own sake, but a new model of how to stand your ground with dignity. They saw that you could say no to the most powerful country in the world and still hold your head high, still get invited to the table, still shape the future. This is what makes Jaishankar's approach so powerful. He doesn't believe in false binaries. He refuses to let India be reduced to someone else's pawn. And in doing so, he's offering the world a new image of leadership, one that is neither submissive nor aggressive, but sovereign in the truest sense. It's important to recognize how rare that is, because sovereignty in the modern global order has often become a performance. Many nations wave the flag of independence, but act in fear. They vote in the UN with hesitation, negotiate with compromise written into their posture, and build policies more to avoid punishment than to pursue purpose. India, under Jaishankar's guidance, is reversing that psychological framework. It's reclaiming sovereignty not just as a legal status, but as an existential stance. It's saying, we are not here to be managed, cajoled, or conditioned. We are here to engage, to contribute, and to decide on our own terms. And this shift is having ripple effects, because every time India refuses to bow, another country sees that they might not have to either. Every time Jaishankar stands firm, the myth of Western monopoly on moral clarity weakens, and every time India acts from its own interest without apology, the very nature of global power begins to change. This is the beauty of what's unfolding. The West, in attempting to isolate India for its choices, has only isolated itself from the reality of a changing world. And India, by staying rooted and rational, has not only avoided the trap, it has changed the game. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a very simple but powerful insight. Pressure only works on those who feel inferior. And when a nation knows its value, when it no longer needs to seek external validation, it becomes immune to manipulation. That's the final strike, not one that destroys the enemy, but one that exposes the illusion of their control. Let that lesson echo in your own life. Stand firm, think clearly, and never surrender your voice to those who haven't earned the right to guide it. Because true power begins the moment you stop reacting and start responding from a place of strength, from a place of clarity, from a place that can't be pressured into submission. Strategic autonomy. That phrase might sound clinical, even bureaucratic, like something you'd find buried in a policy document or foreign affairs white paper. But when you strip it down, when you actually confront what it means, you discover something remarkably profound. It's not just a doctrine, it's a declaration of identity, it's a psychological shift. It's the moment when a nation says, we will think for ourselves, act for ourselves, and bear the consequences of our choices without flinching. And it's precisely this stance that India, through the steady hand of Jaishankar, has begun to embody on the world stage. Now, the temptation in geopolitics has always been to pick a side. History conditions us into binary choices, east or west, capitalism or communism, allegiance or rebellion. You're either a friend or a foe, a partner or a threat. But Jaishankar understands something deeper. something that transcends the transactional logic of alliances. He recognizes that true power doesn't come from who you align with. It comes from asterisk, whether asterisk you can choose to align at all asterisk or not asterisk. In other words, it's not who you're standing with, but whether you're capable of standing alone when it matters. This is the heart of strategic autonomy, and it's not easy, because it requires a nation to develop a spine, to hold its own posture even while larger powers loom. It means resisting the urge to conform for short-term benefits. It means choosing the harder road of self-determination over the easier one of managed compliance. India's refusal to blindly follow Western narratives in the wake of global crises, whether that's the Ukraine conflict, sanctions, trade wars, or climate targets, is not a sign of indecision. It's not an evasion of responsibility. Quite the opposite. It's an assertion of maturity. It's the behavior of a nation that no longer feels the need to outsource its judgment to foreign capitals. And that is a rare thing in a world that still expects developing nations to ask for permission before forming an opinion. You can see this psychological shift in the language Jaishankar uses. When asked whether India will follow Western sanctions, he doesn't get drawn into their frame. He reframes, "We will do what is in our national interest." It's simple, yes, but it's seismic. Because that phrase carries with it centuries of suppressed agency, it speaks on behalf of a nation that was, for too long, told what to do, first by colonizers, then by Cold War chess players, and finally by modern moral arbiters cloaked in diplomatic niceties. Strategic autonomy, then, is not just about independence, it's about authorship. It's about writing your own role in the global narrative instead of being assigned one by those who claim to know better. That's the game India is now playing, and winning, not by outmuscling other powers, but by outlasting their assumptions. Think about the psychological implications here. When you're constantly seeking approval, your decisions are always filtered through the fear of rejection. That's true for individuals, and it's true for nations. You become reactive. You negotiate from a place of anxiety, not confidence. But once you begin to operate from a stable sense of identity, that changes. You begin to speak, not because you're trying to be accepted, but because you have something necessary to say. That's the space India is now occupying, and of course, this kind of autonomy doesn't come without consequences. There are costs, trade-offs, diplomatic tensions, but here's the crucial insight. Asterisk freedom is never free. Asterisk it demands clarity, it demands endurance, and it demands the courage to be misunderstood, at least for a time, by those who still think power flows in only one direction. India is showing the world that you can engage without being entangled, that you can cooperate without being co-opted, that you can be global without being governed, and this redefinition is not just good for India. It's good for the world, because it expands the moral and strategic possibilities for every nation watching. It says to them, asterisk, you are allowed to act from your interests, your values, your truth, even if it unsettles the so-called consensus. Asterisk, Jaishankar's genius lies in making this look not radical, but reasonable. He doesn't yell, he doesn't provoke, he doesn't posture. He simply operates from a place of inner clarity, and that itself becomes a form of power, a quiet, composed, deeply rooted power, and in a world addicted to noise, clarity is revolutionary. You see, strategic autonomy isn't about isolation. That's a common misconception. It's not about walking away from the world. It's about walking asterisk into asterisk the world with your head high, knowing that you bring something of value to the table. It's the difference between being a guest and being a host, between being tolerated and being respected, and that respects, lowly but surely, is exactly what India is earning, not because it mimics the West, not because it aligns on every issue, but because it is willing to be consistent in its logic and confident in its direction. That steadiness, over time, builds credibility, and credibility, unlike coercion, cannot be imposed. It must be earned, and India is earning it through disciplined autonomy, The broader takeaway here for all of us is deeply personal, because we too are pressured by culture, by peers, by systems, to conform, to please, to avoid friction. But if there's anything to learn from India's journey, it's this. Asterisk, your integrity is worth the discomfort it creates in others. Asterisk, strategic autonomy, whether in foreign policy or in life, means choosing the harder path of principled action over the easier path of borrowed convictions. So here's what I'll leave you with. Asterisk, asterisk, when you learn to stand alone, you begin to stand for something. Asterisk, asterisk, and when you stand for something, the world eventually has no choice but to listen. When a nation begins to speak not only with strength but with certainty, when it stops echoing the voices of others and starts to project its own, something extraordinary happens. The world begins to listen. Not just out of curiosity and not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Recognition that a new center of gravity has formed, one that doesn't demand submission, but instead invites a reconsideration of what leadership in the 21st century might actually look like. India is becoming that center, slowly, quietly, and perhaps most powerfully, psychologically. Now, I want you to think about something fundamental. Throughout history, the world has been shaped not just by physical might or economic leverage, but by narratives. By the asterisk ideas asterisk that civilizations project about who they are, what they represent, and how they believe the world should be ordered. The Western world, for example, spent centuries crafting a story in which it alone stood for reason, progress, human rights, and modernity. The rest of the world in this story was framed as catching up, evolving, learning. That narrative has been so deeply embedded in global institutions and international discourse that for a long time it went largely unchallenged. But that story is beginning to break down, and not because someone declared war on it, but because someone offered an alternative, not aggressively, not through slogans or propaganda, but through clarity, consistency, and conviction. That someone is India, and the man articulating it on the global stage with calm precision is Dr. S. JAISHANKAR. What India is projecting now is more than a foreign policy. It's a worldview, one that says, asterisk, we are not here to imitate your path. We are not here to validate your definitions of success. We are here to show that there are other ways, equally modern, equally rational, equally human, that do not require abandoning who we are. Asterisk, this is what makes India's rise so psychologically disruptive to the established order. It's not rising asterisk despite asterisk its civilizational roots. It's rising asterisk because asterisk of them, and that, for much of the post-colonial world, is deeply affirming, because it suggests that modernization and westernization are not synonymous. That development doesn't have to mean dislocation, that becoming global doesn't require erasing the local. What JAISHANKAR represents is this new psychological order. A world in which the moral and intellectual authority of the West is no longer taken as default, where other voices are no longer filtered through a Western lens to be made palatable, and where legitimacy is no longer borrowed but asserted. This is why countries like Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and even traditional U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt are now looking toward India, not just as a partner, but as a model. They see in India a nation that navigates the world with balance, that does not seek to dominate, and that manages to preserve its identity while expanding its influence. They see an example of how to lead without becoming a mirror of someone else's values. And that's no small thing, because leadership asterisk, real asterisk leadership, is not about control, it's about inspiration. It's about becoming the kind of presence that changes others not through force, but through example. Through how you carry yourself, through how you respond when pushed, through what you asterisk don't asterisk say when provoked, through what you asterisk refuse asterisk to compromise when it's inconvenient. India, under JAISHANKAR'S guidance, is displaying this quiet leadership in profound ways. By refusing to be lectured, by refusing to align blindly, by refusing to reduce its complex reality to simple ideological categories. That restraint, that poise, that psychological composure is the very thing that's shaking the old global order. Because what do you do when a nation doesn't get angry when you expect it to? What do you do when it doesn't beg for inclusion or approval? What do you do when it doesn't collapse under moral scrutiny, but calmly reveals the contradictions in your question? You're forced to reckon with the possibility that your authority isn't what it used to be. You're forced to listen, and that is what the world is now doing, listening. This isn't just an Indian moment. It's a civilizational reawakening that echoes far beyond South Asia. It tells every culture that has been sidelined, mocked, or managed that their traditions, philosophies, and identities are not obstacles to modernity, but assets. That strength can come from memory, and clarity can come from roots. That you don't need to erase your past to be part of the future. We need to realize that power is not just exercised through institutions. It's expressed through posture, through how you speak, how you stand, how you carry your values into spaces that were never designed to accommodate them. And JAISHANKAR is showing us how to do exactly that, with rigor, with intelligence, with grace. So what does that mean for us, citizens, thinkers, leaders, students? It means that in a world still trying to shape us into something convenient, our most radical act is to remain grounded, to refuse to reduce our complexity to fit into someone else's simplicity, to develop the inner strength to speak not from the fear of rejection, but from the conviction of truth. That's how nations rise. That's how people rise. That's how civilizations revive themselves. Not by overpowering others, but by remembering who they are. So here's the final thought. The future doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the clearest one. And right now, India's voice is rising, not because it seeks to dominate, but because it dares to speak with the weight of its own truth. Let your voice do the same.